The divorce papers were placed on the table, with deliberate care. Zachary Walker didn't bother lowering his voice. "I just won $2 million," he said, glancing around the office as if the room itself should admire him. "I'm not spending the rest of my life tied to a marriage that drags me down." Across from him sat Eliza Montgomery Walker, 9 months pregnant, her hands folded quietly over the curve of her stomach. The lawyers watched. The assistant stopped typing. Eliza said nothing. What Zachary Walker didn't know was this: in 72 hours a will would be opened in Chicago, and Eliza Montgomery would inherit $200 million.
If you believe that a person's true character is revealed when money suddenly appears, then this story may stay with you until the very end. Before we continue, take a moment to share something simple in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Stories like this travel across time zones, and it's always fascinating to see where they reach. And if you appreciate stories about quiet strength, justice, and dignity, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the rest of what happens next.
Sacramento, California was a city that rarely appeared in stories about sudden wealth. Most lives there moved in steady, predictable lines: commutes, paychecks, mortgages, and weekend grocery trips beneath wide suburban skies. For most of their marriage, Eliza Montgomery Walker had believed her life would follow that same quiet pattern. She worked as a senior billing accountant at Sacramento Community Medical Center, a job that demanded patience more than excitement. Eliza had always possessed a certain calm precision that suited numbers well. She balanced accounts, audited insurance claims, and reviewed expense reports with the same careful attention she applied to the rest of her life. Colleagues often noticed the small notebook she carried in her bag. In it, Eliza recorded everything: monthly expenses, grocery costs, rent payments, insurance renewals. Even the occasional impulse purchase, always marked with a date and a brief note explaining why. It wasn't anxiety that drove the habit. It was discipline. Eliza believed that most problems in life didn't arrive suddenly. They built slowly, piece by piece, until the pattern finally became visible. Her husband, Zachary Walker, lived by a very different philosophy. Zachary sold cars at Capitol Valley Auto Mall, a sprawling dealership that stretched across several blocks near Interstate 80. The job rewarded confidence and charm, both qualities Zachary possessed in abundance. He could talk easily with strangers. He remembered names. He laughed loudly, shook hands firmly, and carried himself with the easy swagger of someone who believed the future was waiting just around the corner. But there was another side to that confidence. Zachary had always believed he was meant for something bigger than an ordinary paycheck. Sometimes late at night he would scroll through financial videos on his phone, entrepreneurs discussing investments, real estate gurus explaining passive income lottery winners, describing the moment their lives changed forever. "People don't get rich playing it safe," he once told Eliza over dinner. Eliza listened quietly while cutting vegetables for a salad. "What makes you think I'm playing it safe?" she asked gently. Zachary smiled. "Because you track grocery receipts." Eliza didn't argue. She simply placed the salad bowl on the table and sat down. They had met 5 years earlier at a summer street fair in Midtown Sacramento. Eliza had been volunteering at a hospital fundraiser booth. Zachary had wandered over while waiting for friends at a nearby food truck. He noticed her first because she wasn't trying to attract attention. While others laughed loudly and waved people toward donation jars, Eliza calmly organized pamphlets into neat stacks. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, and there was a quiet focus in the way she worked. Zachary had leaned against the booth and said, "You look like the only person here who actually knows what's going on." Eliza looked up slightly surprised. "I'm just sorting brochures," she said. "Exactly," Zachary replied. "Everyone else looks like they're pretending." It was the kind of line that usually made people laugh. Eliza only smiled faintly. Something about that calm response intrigued Zachary enough that he stayed. Within 6 months they were dating. Within 2 years they were married. The early years of their marriage were stable, if not glamorous. They rented a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex near Elk Grove. The building faced a small park where children rode bicycles in slow circles around cracked sidewalks. Most evenings followed a simple rhythm. Eliza returned home around 6, often carrying folders of work she wanted to review. Zachary arrived slightly later, usually energized from a day spent negotiating deals with customers. Dinner was rarely elaborate. Pasta, stir-fry, occasionally takeout when Zachary closed a good sale. They spoke about ordinary things, traffic, work frustrations, plans for the weekend. Zachary often talked about bigger possibilities. One night he described a coworker who had invested in cryptocurrency. Another night he mentioned a customer who claimed to have flipped 3 houses in 1 year. "People are making serious money out there," Zachary said, tapping his phone screen. Eliza nodded. "Yes," she replied quietly. But she never sounded convinced, for her security mattered more than sudden fortune. Their financial life reflected that difference. Eliza managed the household accounts. Every paycheck was divided. Carefully rent, utilities, groceries, savings. Zachary respected the system at first. Then slowly, small exceptions appeared. It started with the lottery tickets. At first they were occasional purchases, 1 ticket on Friday evenings, when Zachary stopped at a convenience store after work. "It's just $2, he said lightly. Eliza wrote it down in her notebook anyway. Date, amount, purpose, lottery. Over time, the purchases became routine. Every week, sometimes twice. Sacramento was full of places that sold tickets. Gas stations, grocery stores, liquor shops glowing under fluorescent lights late at night. Zachary liked the brief moment when he checked the numbers. The pause before possibility collapsed back into ordinary reality. He often joked about what he would do if he ever won. "I'd buy a house with a pool," he said once. Eliza raised an eyebrow. "You don't even swim, I'd learn," Zachary replied. Another time he said, "First thing I'd do is quit my job." Eliza considered that. And then what Zachary hesitated. "Well, I'd figure that out after." The conversation ended there. Eliza never told him to stop buying the tickets, but she noticed patterns. The weeks when Zachary spent more than usual, the times when he came home frustrated after checking the results. Still, life continued, until the day Eliza told him she was pregnant. The news arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. Zachary stared at the pregnancy test in disbelief before breaking into a wide grin. "We're going to be parents," he said. For several months, his excitement seemed genuine. He talked about decorating a nursery. He searched online for cribs and strollers. But as the pregnancy progressed, other pressures appeared. Medical appointments, future childcare costs, the idea of supporting a growing family on uncertain commissions. Zachary became restless. He spent more time scrolling through financial forums, more time watching videos about wealth and opportunity, and he continued buying lottery tickets every week, sometimes standing in line behind construction workers and college students at a convenience store near the dealership. He always imagined the same moment, the one where everything changed. Eliza watched all of this quietly. Her notebook grew thicker with entries: electric bills, doctor visits, grocery receipts, lottery purchases. She didn't complain, she didn't criticize, but she recorded everything. By the time Eliza reached the 8th month of pregnancy, the Sacramento summer had grown heavy with heat. The air shimmered above highways, and the city moved more slowly under the weight of late August. Zachary had begun checking lottery numbers almost obsessively, sometimes twice in the same evening. He didn't realize that Eliza had noticed another pattern. The closer the baby's due date came, the more Zachary talked about money. Not responsibility, not family. Money. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between those conversations, the shape of something larger was already beginning to form. Neither of them knew yet how drastically their lives were about to change. But Eliza, with her quiet habit of observation, had already begun to see the first outlines of it. And she wrote them down. The winning ticket was checked on a Tuesday evening. Zachary Walker had stopped at the same convenience store he visited nearly every week, Sunrise Market, a narrow shop squeezed between a laundromat and a vape store on Folsom Boulevard. The fluorescent lights inside hummed faintly above rows of snacks and lottery posters taped along the walls. He almost didn't check the ticket that night. The baby was due soon. Work had been slow. A customer had backed out of a deal that afternoon, leaving Zachary irritated and tired. Still, habit pulled him toward the small lottery scanner near the counter. He slid the ticket beneath the red beam. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the machine beeped. A message flashed across the screen. "Please see retailer." Zachary frowned. He scanned it again. The same message appeared. Behind the counter, the clerk, a college-aged employee named Luis Ortega, looked up. "You got something?" Luis asked. "I don't know," Zachary said, trying to sound casual. Luis stepped around the counter and checked the ticket manually through the terminal. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Man," he said slowly, "you're going to want to sit down." Zachary laughed nervously. "How much? A few hundred?" Luis turned the screen so Zachary could see. The numbers appeared clearly under the store's harsh lights. $2 million. Jackpot. For several seconds, Zachary didn't breathe. The air inside the small store suddenly felt different, thicker, brighter, unreal. "Is that real?" he asked. Luis nodded. "Looks pretty real to me." Zachary grabbed the counter to steady himself. $2 million. The number echoed in his mind like a door opening somewhere far away. Luis began explaining the process, how large winnings required a claim through the California lottery office, how taxes would apply, how the payment might be structured. Zachary barely heard him. His thoughts were already racing ahead. A house, a new car, freedom from sales quotas. Every quiet frustration he had ever carried suddenly seemed temporary. When he left the store, the night air felt electric. He sat in his car for several minutes before calling Eliza. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said. "Did you pick up the milk?" Zachary laughed loudly. "Forget the milk," he said. "We just won $2 million. There was a brief pause. Eliza didn't react immediately. "Are you serious?" she asked calmly. "Dead serious." Zachary described the scanner, the clerk, the numbers. Even over the phone, Eliza could hear the excitement rushing through his voice like a current. "I'll show you when I get home," he said. When Zachary arrived at the apartment 20 minutes later, Eliza was sitting at the small dining table with her notebook open. Her hand rested against the curve of her stomach. "Let me see it," she said. Zachary placed the ticket on the table like a trophy. Eliza studied it carefully. The printed numbers, the official seal, the small barcode that had triggered the scanner. "It looks real," she said. Zachary pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "We're rich," he said. Eliza tilted her head slightly. "Not exactly," she replied. Zachary frowned. $2 million is pretty rich. After taxes, it will be less," Eliza said. "And we should speak to a financial advisor before making decisions." Zachary leaned back in his chair. He had expected excitement, celebration. Instead, Eliza's calm response felt almost clinical. "Come on, Eliza," he said. "This changes everything." Eliza didn't argue. She simply opened her notebook and wrote a new entry. "Lottery winnings, pending confirmation." Zachary watched her for a moment before shaking his head with a laugh. "You're unbelievable." The next few days moved quickly. Zachary visited the California Lottery District office in Sacramento to begin the claims process. The officials there verified the ticket and explained the financial breakdown. After federal and state taxes,
The final payout would be closer to $1.3 million. Still an enormous sum, still life-changing. Zachary signed the necessary paperwork with growing confidence. He began speaking differently, almost immediately. At the dealership, he told co-workers about the win. At first, they congratulated him enthusiastically. Soon the conversation shifted. People asked questions. What was he going to buy? Was he quitting? Would he invest? Zachary enjoyed the attention. He started researching luxury cars online. One afternoon, he test drove a Porsche 911 just for fun. That same week, he opened a new personal bank account. When Eliza noticed the confirmation email on their shared laptop, she said nothing. She simply wrote down the bank's name in her notebook. The changes were subtle at first. Zachary began coming home later. Sometimes he stopped for drinks with co-workers. Other nights he spent hours scrolling through investment forums. "You have to make money grow," he told Eliza one evening. "That's what smart people do." Eliza listened quietly while folding baby clothes they had recently purchased. "What kind of investments?" she asked. "Maybe real estate," Zachary said. "Or maybe a business. Have you spoken to a financial planner?" "Not yet." Eliza nodded slowly. Zachary noticed another shift inside himself as well. A feeling he hadn't expected. Distance. The apartment that once felt comfortable now seemed small. The furniture looked cheaper. Even conversations with Eliza felt slower. One night, Zachary returned home after meeting with a financial consultant recommended by a co-worker. The consultant's name was Victor Lang. Victor specialized in advising new lottery winners. He had spoken confidently about protecting assets, separating accounts, and ensuring financial independence. "People change when money appears," Victor had said during their meeting. "You have to protect yourself." The phrase echoed in Zachary's mind as he walked into the apartment. Eliza was sitting at the kitchen table again, reviewing a stack of hospital paperwork related to the upcoming birth. "You're late," she said gently. "Meeting ran long," Zachary replied. He opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. "Eliza," he said after a moment, "have you ever thought about how different life could be?" Eliza looked up. "In what way, freedom?" Zachary said. "No more worrying about bills." Eliza closed the folder slowly. "I don't worry about bills," she said. Zachary laughed. "Because you track every penny." "Yes," she said calmly. "That's why." The conversation ended there. But something small had shifted. Over the next few days, Zachary spoke more often with Victor Lang. Their discussions began to include legal considerations, asset protection, financial separation. Victor mentioned something that caught Zachary's attention. "If your marital situation ever changed," Victor said carefully, "there are legal ways to protect lottery winnings." Zachary didn't respond immediately, but the idea stayed with him. Meanwhile, Eliza continued preparing for the baby's arrival. Doctor appointments, hospital bags, insurance forms. She moved slowly now, carrying the weight of 9 months with quiet endurance. Zachary noticed something else during that time. Eliza never asked about the money. Not once. She never asked how much remained after taxes. She never asked what he planned to buy. She simply continued recording expenses, observing, writing. The distance between them grew gradually like a widening crack in pavement. Zachary believed he was stepping into a larger future. Eliza saw something else entirely. Patterns, changes in tone, changes in behavior, changes in language, and she wrote every one of them down. Because Eliza Montgomery had always believed that people revealed their true intentions, not when they were struggling, but when opportunity finally arrived. The idea of divorce did not arrive suddenly in Zachary Walker's mind. Like most decisions that changed lives, it appeared gradually, first as a quiet thought, then as a possibility, and finally as something that began to feel inevitable. $2 million had a strange effect on perspective.
At first, Zachary believed the money would simply improve his life. A larger apartment, a better car, less pressure at work. But as the days passed, the number started to represent something else. Freedom. The word surfaced during a conversation with Victor Lang, the financial advisor who had begun helping Zachary plan the future of his winnings. Victor's office sat on the 12th floor of a modern glass building near downtown Sacramento. The room was decorated in careful neutrality gray furniture, framed financial charts and shelves filled with thick binders. During their second meeting, Victor leaned back in his chair and asked a simple question. What do you want your life to look like in 5 years? Zachary thought about it for a moment. A house, he said. A good investment portfolio. Maybe my own business. Victor nodded. And your current lifestyle supports that? Zachary hesitated. Not exactly. Victor tapped his pen lightly against the desk. You're married, he said, and expecting a child. Yes, marriage can complicate asset protection, Victor continued, especially when new wealth appears. Zachary frowned slightly. What do you mean? Victor chose his words carefully. I mean that large financial changes sometimes reveal different priorities between partners. The sentence lingered in the quiet office. Zachary stared through the window toward the Sacramento skyline. He thought about the apartment, the small kitchen table, Eliza's notebook, the calm way she discussed budgets. For years he had accepted that structure. Now it felt restrictive. What if someone wanted to manage their own finances independently? Zachary asked. Victor shrugged slightly. Then they would speak with a family law attorney. Victor slid a business card across the desk. The name printed on it read, Daniel Reeves, Reeves Family, Law. Zachary slipped the card into his wallet without commenting further. The idea followed him home that evening. The apartment felt unusually quiet when he entered. Eliza was sitting in the living room chair with her feet elevated on a pillow. A prenatal guidebook rested open beside her. How was the meeting? She asked. Fine, Zachary replied. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the kitchen counter. Eliza turned a page slowly. The doctor called earlier, she said. They scheduled another checkup next week. Zachary nodded but didn't respond. Eliza looked up. Is something wrong? Zachary hesitated. No, he said finally. Just thinking. Eliza studied him for a moment. About what? Zachary shrugged. Life. Eliza didn't press further. She had noticed the shift in him long before that evening, the way he spoke differently, the way conversations about the baby had grown shorter, the way he spent more time outside the apartment. Instead of confronting him, Eliza simply recorded the changes, date, behavior, observation. 3 days later, Zachary called the number on Victor's business card. The receptionist at Reeves Family Law answered with professional efficiency. Good afternoon, Reeves Family Law. How may I assist you? I'd like to schedule a consultation, Zachary said. Within the week, he sat across from Daniel Reeves, a divorce attorney known for handling complex financial cases. Daniel Reeves was in his early 50s with silver hair and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades watching marriages unravel inside legal documents. He listened patiently as Zachary explained the situation. Lottery win, financial planning, a marriage that suddenly felt incompatible with the future he envisioned. Daniel folded his hands on the desk. Let me ask a few questions, he said. Zachary nodded. When did you receive the lottery winnings? 2 weeks ago, and the ticket was purchased individually. Yes, Daniel made a note. In California, lottery winnings are often considered community property if acquired during marriage. He explained, but circumstances and timing matter. Zachary leaned forward. So what are my options? Daniel looked at him carefully. If you intend to separate finances, acting sooner rather than later could limit how assets are divided. The phrase echoed in Zachary's mind. Acting sooner. So divorce would protect the money, Zachary asked. Daniel didn't answer directly. Divorce is a legal restructuring of a marriage, he said calmly. Asset division becomes part of that process. Zachary sat silently for a moment. The decision no longer felt abstract. It felt like strategy. "What if my wife is pregnant?" Zachary asked. Daniel paused briefly. "The pregnancy itself does not prevent divorce proceedings," he said, "but the court will consider child support and parental responsibility." Zachary exhaled slowly. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Legal frameworks, financial disclosures, temporary agreements. When Zachary finally stood to leave, Daniel handed him a folder containing preliminary documents. "If you decide to move forward," Daniel said, "we can schedule a formal meeting with both parties." Zachary left the office with the folder tucked under his arm. Outside, Sacramento traffic moved steadily through the late afternoon heat. He sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine. Part of him felt uneasy. Another part felt strangely relieved. For the first time since the lottery win, he believed he was taking control of his future. That evening, Eliza noticed the folder immediately. It rested on the kitchen counter beside Zachary's keys. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked at Zachary. "What's that?" she asked. "Work stuff," he said quickly. Eliza nodded. She did not question the answer. Later that night, after Zachary fell asleep, Eliza sat quietly at the dining table. Her notebook lay open beneath the soft glow of a lamp. She wrote several lines. Date: consultation with attorney likely. Behavior indicates preparation for legal action. She closed the notebook gently. Outside the apartment window, Sacramento's city lights flickered in the distance. The next morning, Zachary sent an email to Daniel Reeves confirming that he wanted to proceed. A meeting was scheduled for the following week. Both spouses were required to attend. The email notification appeared on Eliza's phone shortly after noon, while she was finishing a report at the hospital. She read the message once, then again. Her expression remained calm. She closed the email and placed her phone back in her bag. For the rest of the day, Eliza continued working as usual. But when she returned home that evening, she opened her notebook again. She wrote only one line. Divorce meeting scheduled. No anger, no questions, just documentation. Because Eliza Montgomery had always believed that when people made decisions under the influence of money, the consequences would eventually reveal themselves. All she had to do was watch and wait. The Office of Reeves Family Law was designed to feel neutral. Soft beige walls, framed landscapes, a long polished conference table placed beneath quiet ceiling lights. It was the kind of room where difficult conversations were meant to appear civilized. On a Tuesday morning in late August, 5 people sat inside it. Daniel Reeves, the divorce attorney, sat at the head of the table, with a stack of legal documents neatly aligned before him. To his right was his assistant, Melissa Grant, who typed quietly on a laptop. Near the window stood Victor Lang, Zachary's financial advisor, reviewing several printed spreadsheets. And across the table sat the couple whose marriage had quietly reached its final chapter. Zachary Walker leaned back in his chair, one arm resting along the table's edge. Across from him sat Eliza Montgomery Walker, her posture straight, despite the strain of 9 months of pregnancy. Her hands rested lightly over the curve of her stomach. The air inside the room carried the faint scent of coffee and printer ink. Daniel Reeves cleared his throat gently. "Thank you both for coming today," he began. "The purpose of this meeting is to review the proposed terms of separation and begin the process of legal dissolution, if both parties agree." His tone was professional, controlled. Zachary nodded quickly. Eliza said nothing. Daniel opened the first document. "Mr. Walker has requested that we formalize a divorce proceeding," he continued. "Several temporary agreements have been drafted to address housing finances and upcoming parental responsibilities. Melissa Grant slid a copy of the documents across the table toward Eliza. The papers moved slowly across the polished wood surface until they stopped near her hands. Eliza looked down at them. She did not pick them up immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly around the room. Melissa typing, Victor adjusting his glasses, Daniel waiting calmly, Zachary watching her. Finally, Eliza lifted the first page. Her eyes moved across the lines with careful attention. Zachary shifted slightly in his chair. The silence lasted longer than he expected. Eventually, Daniel spoke again. The documents outline a temporary financial arrangement, he said. Mr. Walker will retain control of the lottery winnings acquired earlier this month while providing a modest support structure for the child after birth. Eliza turned another page. Zachary leaned forward. I think it's important to be honest here, he said. Daniel glanced at him but allowed him to continue. Zachary folded his hands on the table. I didn't expect my life to change this quickly, he said. Eliza's eyes remained on the documents. But now that it has, Zachary continued, I need to think about my future. Melissa's typing slowed slightly. Victor looked up from his papers. Eliza turned another page. Zachary exhaled his voice, gaining confidence. I just won $2 million, he said. That kind of opportunity doesn't come twice. The statement hung in the air. Daniel remained still. Eliza continued reading. I'm not saying Eliza is a bad person, Zachary added. But the life we built together, it's small. Eliza's fingers paused briefly on the page. Zachary leaned back again. I don't want to raise a child in a marriage that limits what I can become. Melissa's typing stopped entirely now. Victor shifted uncomfortably near the window. Daniel Reeves remained composed, though his eyes moved quietly between the two spouses. Across the table, Eliza finally lifted her gaze. She looked directly at Zachary, not with anger, not with disbelief, just calm observation. Are you finished? She asked quietly. Zachary blinked. Yes, he said. Eliza lowered her eyes again and returned to the documents. The rest of the meeting moved forward with clinical precision. Daniel explained the legal language, temporary housing arrangements, initial child support calculations, the timeline for formal court filing. Zachary signed several pages quickly, his pen moving with confident strokes. Each signature felt like progress. When the documents reached Eliza, she read every line carefully. She took her time. At one point, Melissa glanced toward Daniel as if asking silently whether they should hurry the process. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. Finally, Eliza picked up the pen. She signed where indicated. Her handwriting was small and precise. Once the signatures were complete, Daniel gathered the papers into a neat stack. These documents will begin the formal legal process, he said. He paused briefly before adding, the court will review all terms during the official hearing. Zachary nodded. Eliza closed her folder. For a moment, no one moved. Then Zachary stood. Well, he said, adjusting his jacket. I guess that's done. Daniel remained seated. Eliza, he said gently, do you have any questions before we conclude? Eliza shook her head. No, she replied. Her voice remained steady. Zachary picked up his car keys from the table. Good, he said. Victor cleared his throat awkwardly. Zachary, we should probably review the next financial steps this afternoon. Sure, Zachary said. Eliza rose slowly from her chair. The effort of standing was visible now. Daniel noticed. Would you like assistance? He asked. Eliza offered a small smile. I'm fine, she said. She gathered the copy of documents Melissa had provided and placed them neatly inside her bag. Zachary walked toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced back once more. Eliza, he said. She looked at him. "I hope this works out for both of us," he said. Eliza studied him for a moment. Then she nodded slightly. "So do I." Her voice carried no bitterness, no accusation, just acceptance. Zachary seemed satisfied with the response. He left the room, with Victor following close behind. The door closed softly. Inside the office, silence settled again. Melissa resumed typing. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at Eliza thoughtfully. "You handled that calmly," he said. Eliza adjusted the strap of her bag. "Is that unusual?" she asked. Daniel gave a small shrug. "In my experience," he said, "divorce meetings often involve stronger emotions." Eliza considered that. "I imagine they do." Daniel hesitated for a moment. "If you need legal guidance of your own," he added carefully, "you are entitled to independent representation." Eliza nodded. "I understand." She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she paused briefly. "Mr. Reeves," she said. "Yes, could I request a copy of the meeting transcript when it becomes available?" Daniel looked slightly surprised. "Of course," he said. "We keep full documentation of all proceedings." "Thank you." Eliza left the office quietly. Outside, the Sacramento sunlight felt warm against her face. Traffic moved steadily along the street below. People walked past without noticing anything unusual. Inside her bag rested the signed divorce documents. Eliza reached into the side pocket and removed her notebook. She leaned against the building's stone wall and wrote several lines. Date: divorce initiated. Key statements recorded. She closed the notebook slowly. Across the city, Zachary Walker believed he had just stepped into a larger future. But Eliza Montgomery had already begun documenting the path that would lead somewhere very different, and she intended to remember every step. 2 days after the meeting at Reeves Family Law, Sacramento woke beneath a pale gray sky. The morning air carried the quiet heaviness that sometimes settled over the city before autumn arrived. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 5 and the sidewalks around Sacramento Community Medical Center filled with nurses finishing overnight shifts. Inside the hospital's administrative wing, Eliza Montgomery Walker sat at her desk, reviewing billing adjustments for a cardiology department report. Her movements were deliberate, as they always were. She finished one column of numbers, verified the totals, and wrote a short note in the margin. Then her phone vibrated. The number displayed on the screen was unfamiliar. Chicago area code. Eliza stared at the phone for a moment before answering. "This is Eliza Montgomery," she said. The voice on the other end was calm, older and distinctly professional. "Good morning, Ms. Montgomery. My name is Jonathan Carter. I'm an attorney with Whitmore and Carter, LLP in Chicago." Eliza waited. "I'm calling regarding a matter connected to the estate of Harold Whitmore," he continued. The name meant nothing to her. "I'm sorry," Eliza said politely. "I believe you may have the wrong person." "I don't believe so," Carter replied. "May I confirm your date of birth?" Eliza hesitated briefly, then answered. Carter asked one more question. "Your mother's name was Margaret Montgomery, correct?" "Yes," Eliza said slowly. There was a brief pause on the line. "Then I'm quite certain I've reached the correct person." Eliza leaned back slightly in her chair. "What is this?" Regarding Jonathan Carter's tone remained steady. "Mr. Harold Whitmore passed away last week," he said. "During the preparation of his will, your name appeared as a primary beneficiary." The words landed quietly, almost gently. Eliza did not react immediately. "I'm not familiar with that name," she said. "That's understandable," Carter replied. "Mr. Whitmore had limited contact with certain family members over the years." "Family?" Eliza asked. "Yes." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Eliza Carter said carefully, "Harold Whitmore was your maternal grandfather." The sentence seemed to pause the world around her. Outside the office window, the hospital parking lot shimmered under late morning sunlight. Inside, the hum of printers and distant conversation continued as normal. But Eliza remained still. "My mother never mentioned him," she said quietly. "That aligns with what we've discovered in the family records," Carter replied. "There appears to have been a long period of estrangement." Eliza closed the spreadsheet on her computer screen. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked. "There will be a formal reading of the will this Friday in Chicago," Carter said. "Your presence has been requested." Eliza glanced down at the curve of her stomach. "I'm 9 months pregnant," she said. Carter paused. "We are aware of that," he replied. "If travel is not possible, arrangements can be made for a remote meeting. However, the estate matters are substantial enough that we would prefer to explain them in person." Substantial enough. The phrase was carefully chosen. Eliza did not ask the question that naturally followed. Instead, she said, "What exactly do you mean by substantial?" There was a brief rustle of papers on Carter's end of the call. "The Whitmore estate includes several investment holdings, commercial properties, and long-term financial trusts," he explained. Eliza listened without interruption. "The estimated total value currently exceeds $200 million. The words were spoken calmly, without drama, but they carried a weight that seemed almost unreal. Eliza remained silent for several seconds. Across the office, one of her co-workers laughed at something near the copier. The sound felt strangely distant. "200 million, she repeated. "Yes," Carter's tone remained composed. "Mr. Whitmore structured his will in a way that places you as the primary heir." Eliza exhaled slowly. "I've never even met him." "That appears to be true," Carter said. "Then why would he leave me anything?" That, Carter replied, "is something we will explain during the reading of the will." The call ended shortly after. Carter sent several documents by email confirming the meeting time and travel arrangements. Eliza sat quietly at her desk for a long moment. Her co-workers moved around the office, unaware that anything unusual had happened. Eventually, she reached into her bag and removed her notebook. She opened to a blank page. Then she wrote, "Call from Whitmore and Carter LLP, Chicago. Harold Whitmore, maternal grandfather, deceased. Estate value approximately $200 million. Reading of will scheduled Friday." Her handwriting remained steady. When she finished, she closed the notebook and placed it back in her bag. The rest of the workday continued normally. She completed the cardiology billing report, answered 2 emails from department managers, attended a short administrative meeting. No one noticed that anything had changed. Later that evening, Eliza returned to the apartment. Zachary was sitting on the couch watching a financial news program. A tablet rested on his lap, displaying charts related to real estate investments. "Hey," he said without looking away from the screen. "Hi," Eliza replied. She placed her bag on the kitchen counter. Zachary muted the television. "I spoke with Victor again today," he said. "He thinks there's a good opportunity in commercial properties." Eliza nodded slightly. "That sounds promising." Zachary studied her for a moment. "You're quiet tonight." "I'm tired. Doctor appointment again." She opened the refrigerator and poured a glass of water. Zachary leaned back on the couch. "You know," he said, "once the divorce process moves forward, things are going to feel a lot simpler." Eliza turned toward him. "Simpler. Financially," Zachary explained. "Cleaner structure, more freedom." Eliza held the glass in both hands. "I see." Zachary nodded, clearly pleased with his reasoning. He did not notice the notebook inside her bag. He did not notice the email confirmation from Whitmore and Carter LLP waiting quietly in her inbox. And he did not notice that the future he believed he was carefully designing had already begun shifting in ways he could not yet imagine. Because somewhere in Chicago, lawyers were preparing to open a will, and when they did, the balance of power inside Zachary Walker's life would change in a way no financial advisor could have predicted. For now, Eliza said nothing. She simply watched and waited. 3 days later, Chicago greeted Eliza Montgomery with cool morning air and a skyline that rose sharply against the pale blue horizon. The flight from Sacramento had been long, and every step through the airport required patience. At 9 months pregnant, movement came slowly now, each stride measured carefully. Yet Eliza had insisted on traveling in person. Attorney Jonathan Carter had offered to arrange a video conference. But something about the situation, something in his tone during their phone call, suggested that this was not a matter meant to be handled through a screen. A black sedan, sent by Whitmore and Carter LLP, waited outside O'Hare Airport. The driver, a quiet man named Leon Harris, greeted her politely and loaded her small suitcase into the trunk. Chicago moved past the car windows in long lines of steel and glass. Tall buildings, Lake Michigan stretching out like an endless sheet of gray-blue water. Traffic flowing steadily along wide avenues. Eliza watched silently. She had never visited Chicago before. It felt larger than Sacramento in every way. Louder, faster, more ambitious. The car eventually stopped in front of a historic stone building on LaSalle Street in the heart of the city's financial district. A polished brass plaque beside the entrance read Whitmore and Carter, LLP. Leon opened the door for her. "Take your time," he said. Inside, the lobby carried the quiet elegance of an old institution. Marble floors, high ceilings, tall windows that allowed morning light to pour across the polished surfaces. A receptionist greeted her immediately. "Ms. Montgomery, Mr. Carter is expecting you." Eliza followed her toward a private conference room on the upper floor. When the door opened, 3 people were already seated inside. Jonathan Carter stood as she entered. He was in his early 60s, tall and composed, with the calm demeanor of a man who had spent decades managing complex estates. "Ms. Montgomery," he said warmly, "thank you for coming all this way." Eliza shook his hand. "Thank you for arranging everything," she replied. 2 other individuals were present at the table. A woman with sharp eyes and neatly tied gray hair, Margaret Ellison, the estate's financial trustee, and a younger attorney reviewing several thick folders, Daniel Price, Carter's legal associate. Carter gestured toward a chair. "Please have a seat." Eliza sat carefully. A glass of water had been placed in front of her. For a moment, the room remained quiet. Then Carter opened the folder in front of him. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to acknowledge that this may come as a surprise to you." Eliza nodded slightly. "That would be fair." Carter folded his hands. "Your maternal grandfather, Harold Whitmore, passed away last week at the age of 83. He paused briefly. He was the founder of Whitmore Capital Holdings, an investment firm established nearly 40 years ago. Eliza listened attentively. Carter continued. Mr. Whitmore's business interests expanded over the decades into multiple areas: real estate portfolios, energy investments, and several private equity funds. Margaret Ellison slid a document across the table. "This summary outlines the primary assets currently held within the Whitmore estate," she said. Eliza glanced down at the pages. Columns of figures, corporate names, property listings in cities across the country: Chicago, Dallas, Boston, San Diego. Carter spoke again. "The total estimated value of the estate at this time is approximately $208 million. The number rested quietly in the room. No one rushed the moment. Eliza absorbed the information slowly. Her expression remained calm, but her mind moved carefully through the implications. "My mother never mentioned him," she said after a moment. Carter nodded. "Yes," he replied. "We discovered records indicating that your mother left Chicago in her early 20s after a disagreement with her father." "What kind of disagreement?" Eliza asked. Margaret Ellison exchanged a brief glance with Carter. From what we understand, Carter said gently, your mother wanted to live independently and refused to remain involved in the family business. Eliza considered that. It sounded like something her mother might have done. She passed away 10 years ago, Eliza said quietly. We are aware, Carter replied. He opened another folder. Mr. Whitmore maintained private records concerning your life over the years. Eliza looked up. Records. Carter slid a thin envelope toward her. Inside were several photographs. One showed Eliza graduating from college. Another appeared to be taken outside Sacramento Community Medical Center. A third showed her and Zachary walking through a farmer's market years earlier. Eliza stared at the images. He was watching my life, she asked. Not in a malicious sense, Carter explained. Mr. Whitmore regretted the separation from his daughter deeply. When she passed away, he began quietly following news about you. Eliza traced the edge of one photograph with her finger. But he never contacted me. No. Why, Carter leaned back slightly. He believed you had built a stable life without the influence of his wealth. Margaret Ellison spoke for the first time since handing over the financial report. Mr. Whitmore was very deliberate about how money affected people, she said. Eliza looked at her. What do you mean? He believed sudden wealth revealed character, Margaret replied. The phrase lingered in the room. Carter continued. In the final version of his will, Mr. Whitmore named you as the primary heir to the Whitmore estate. Daniel Price slid a thick document across the table. This is the official will, he said. Eliza placed her hand on the document but did not open it yet. What exactly does primary heir mean? She asked. Carter answered carefully. It means that the majority of Mr. Whitmore's holdings, including the controlling shares of Whitmore Capital Holdings, will transfer to you. Eliza's gaze moved slowly across the room. And the rest of the family, Margaret Ellison spoke again. Your grandfather had distant relatives, but none directly involved in the business. Several charitable trusts also receive portions of the estate. Eliza nodded. Another question formed in her mind. What happens next? Daniel Price responded. Over the next several months, the assets will be formally transferred through legal channels. During that time, we will assist you in understanding the responsibilities associated with managing the estate. Eliza sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered most to her. Is this information public? Carter shook his head. Not yet. Estate transfers remain confidential until filings are completed. Eliza exhaled slowly. That would be helpful. Carter studied her expression. May I ask why Eliza rested her hand lightly against her stomach? I'm currently in the middle of divorce proceedings, she said. The three attorneys exchanged subtle glances. I see, Carter replied. In California. Margaret Ellison leaned forward slightly. That makes confidentiality even more important, she said. Daniel Price made a note on his legal pad. We can delay any public filings until the appropriate time, he added. Eliza nodded. Thank you. The meeting continued for another hour. They discussed estate management, trust structures, investment oversight. But throughout the conversation, one thing remained clear. Eliza Montgomery was now responsible for a financial legacy worth more than $200 million. When the meeting ended, Carter escorted her toward the elevator. You handled that information remarkably calmly, he said. Eliza gave a small smile. I work with numbers every day, she replied. Carter nodded thoughtfully. Yes, he said, but numbers like these tend to change people. Eliza stepped into the elevator. Sometimes, she said, quietly. The doors closed. Outside, the Chicago skyline stretched toward the horizon. And somewhere across the country, Zachary Walker was still celebrating what he believed was the greatest financial victory of his life. He had no idea that the balance of fortune had already shifted, or that the woman he had just divorced was now quietly becoming one of the wealthiest heirs in the country. But Eliza Montgomery had already made one decision. She would not tell him. Not yet. When Eliza Montgomery returned to Sacramento 2 days later, the late summer heat had settled heavily over the city. The familiar streets looked unchanged. Gas stations buzzing under bright lights, small restaurants lining the sidewalks, cars drifting slowly through afternoon traffic. Yet the world felt subtly different now, not because anything visible had changed, but because Eliza carried knowledge no one around her possessed. Inside her handbag rested a thin folder from Whitmore and Carter LLP. Inside that folder were documents confirming that she was now the primary heir to a financial estate worth more than $200 million. But when Eliza unlocked the door to the apartment she still shared with Zachary Walker, nothing about her behavior suggested that anything extraordinary had happened. Zachary was in the kitchen. He stood over the counter scrolling through his phone, occasionally tapping numbers into a financial calculator app. "Hey," he said without looking up. "Hi," Eliza replied. She placed her bag down carefully. "How was Chicago?" Zachary asked. Eliza removed a bottle of water from the refrigerator. "It was fine." Zachary glanced at her. "You visiting a friend or something?" "Something like that," she said. He nodded casually and returned his attention to the phone. "I've been looking into investment property," he said. "Victor thinks there's a great opportunity outside Roseville." Eliza listened quietly. Zachary turned the screen toward her. "Look at this 4-unit rental building. If I put a down payment from the lottery money, the monthly income could be huge." Eliza studied the numbers for a moment. "Have you spoken with a lawyer about that purchase?" she asked. Zachary laughed. "You sound like my accountant." "I am an accountant," relaxed Zachary said. "It's my money." The words came out lightly, but the meaning was unmistakable. Eliza nodded once. "I understand." Zachary seemed satisfied with the response. He returned to his phone and continued scrolling through real estate listings. Eliza walked into the living room and lowered herself slowly into the armchair near the window. The baby shifted slightly inside her. She rested her hands over her stomach and sat quietly. In her bag, her notebook waited. Later that evening, after Zachary stepped out to meet Victor Lang for drinks, Eliza opened it. She wrote several new entries. Chicago meeting completed. Whitmore estate confirmed, approximately $208 million. Confidential until legal transfer finalized. She paused, then added another line. Decision: do not disclose information during divorce proceedings. Eliza closed the notebook. The reasoning behind the decision was simple. The divorce had already begun, and Zachary had already made his intentions clear. There was no advantage in revealing anything now. Across the city that same evening, Zachary sat at a bar called the Copper Room, a popular spot where salespeople from nearby dealerships often gathered after work. Victor Lang sat across from him, nursing a whiskey. "You should celebrate more," Victor said. "I am celebrating," Zachary replied, raising his glass. Several co-workers joined them throughout the night. News about the lottery win had spread quickly. People congratulated him, asked questions, offered advice. Zachary enjoyed the attention. $2 million, one co-worker said. "That's insane." Zachary smiled. "After taxes, it's less, but still life-changing." Another man leaned closer. "What about your wife?" Zachary shrugged. "Divorce is already in progress." The table went quiet for a moment. "Seriously?" someone asked. "Yeah." Zachary leaned back casually. Timing just worked out that way. Victor Lang remained silent but listened carefully. "You're divorcing your pregnant wife right after winning the lottery?" another co-worker asked. Zachary waved dismissively. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" Zachary took another drink. "It's just reality," he said. "What do you mean?" Zachary looked around the table. "Sometimes money shows you that you've outgrown certain parts of your life." The statement lingered in the air. Someone laughed awkwardly. Victor finally spoke. "You should be careful how you say things like that," he said. Zachary shrugged. "It's the truth." Several people pulled out their phones, recording short videos for social media. One co-worker jokingly said, "Hey, Zach, say something for the camera." Zachary grinned. He raised his glass again. "Here's to freedom," he said. The camera lights blinked. Somewhere in the room, a phone captured the moment. Back at the apartment, Eliza sat quietly at the dining table, reviewing the divorce documents again. Every sentence, every clause. Her training as an accountant made her naturally attentive to details others often missed. One section outlined Zachary's claim that the lottery winnings were his separate financial asset. Another described temporary child support arrangements after the birth. Eliza studied the wording carefully. She did not argue with the documents. She simply read them and noted everything. Hours later, Zachary returned home, slightly after midnight. The smell of alcohol followed him through the door. "Eliza," he called out. She looked up from the table. "You're still awake?" "Yes." Zachary walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. "You should have come out tonight," he said. Everyone was celebrating. Eliza smiled faintly. "I don't think a bar is the best place for someone 9 months pregnant." "Fair point," Zachary admitted. He leaned against the counter. "You know," he said, "once the divorce is finalized, things are going to be a lot easier." Eliza tilted her head slightly. "For you?" Zachary hesitated. "For both of us." Eliza did not challenge the statement. Instead, she closed the folder of legal documents and placed them neatly into her bag. Perhaps she said quietly. Zachary yawned. "I'm going to bed." He disappeared down the hallway. Eliza remained at the table a little longer. After a few minutes, she opened her notebook again. She wrote one more entry. Video recordings likely exist from Copper Room celebration. Statements about divorce and money made publicly. She closed the notebook slowly. Across the city, phones already held copies of the videos from the bar. Zachary laughing. Zachary celebrating. Zachary describing the freedom that money had given him. Eliza did not yet know exactly how those recordings might matter, but she knew something else. People often revealed the most about themselves when they believed they had already won. And so she continued doing what she had always done best, watching, listening, and writing everything down. In the weeks that followed, Zachary Walker began to live as if the future had already arrived. Sacramento noticed the changes first, not in dramatic headlines or public announcements, but in the quiet ways people recognize when someone's life has suddenly shifted. At Capitol Valley Auto Mall, Zachary stopped worrying about sales quotas. Where he once stayed late trying to close deals, he now left early, explaining casually that he had other investments to manage. His co-workers had mixed reactions. Some congratulated him sincerely. Others watched with quiet curiosity. One afternoon, Marcus Hill, a senior salesman who had worked at the dealership for nearly 20 years, leaned against Zachary's desk. "So what's the plan now?" Marcus asked. Zachary glanced up from his phone. "What do you mean you still selling cars?" "For now," Zachary said with a shrug. "But not forever." Marcus nodded slowly. "You got lucky," he said. Zachary smiled. "Luck favors people who take chances." Marcus didn't argue. But he had lived long enough to know that money often changed more than bank accounts. The most visible changes appeared outside of work. Within 2 weeks of receiving his lottery payout, Zachary purchased a dark gray Tesla Model S. The car arrived at the dealership one afternoon, gleaming under the Sacramento sun. Several co-workers gathered around it. "Man, someone said that thing costs almost $100,000. Zachary ran his hand across the hood proudly. "Worth every dollar." He drove it home that evening with the windows down, music playing louder than usual. When he pulled into the apartment parking lot, Eliza was standing near the building entrance, holding a small bag of groceries. The car rolled to a smooth stop in front of her. Zachary stepped out with a wide grin. "What do you think?" he asked. Eliza studied the vehicle. "It's very nice," she said. Zachary waited, expecting more enthusiasm. "That's it?" he asked. "It's a beautiful car," Eliza replied calmly. Zachary laughed. "You really don't get excited about anything, do you?" Eliza lifted the grocery bag slightly. "I get excited about things that matter." Zachary raised an eyebrow. "This matters, perhaps to you." She turned and walked toward the apartment entrance. Zachary watched her for a moment before locking the car and following. Inside the apartment, life continued in its usual quiet rhythm. Eliza attended prenatal appointments, prepared the baby's room, reviewed hospital paperwork. Meanwhile, Zachary's social life expanded quickly. New acquaintances appeared, friends of friends, people who suddenly seemed very interested in spending time with him. Most evenings now ended at restaurants or bars around Sacramento. One place in particular became a regular gathering spot: the Copper Room, the same bar where Zachary had celebrated shortly after the divorce papers were signed. One Friday night, nearly 20 people gathered there: salesmen, local real estate agents, a few people Zachary barely knew. Music played loudly from speakers above the bar. Phones appeared constantly. Videos, photos, social media posts. At one point, someone shouted across the table, "Zach, tell us again how you won." Zachary laughed. "I bought a ticket after work, like always," he said. "Next thing I know, boom, $2 million. Someone raised a glass. To the luckiest guy in Sacramento. The group cheered. A young man across the table began recording another video. "Hey, Zach," he said, pointing the phone toward him. "What's the first rule after winning the lottery?" Zachary grinned. "Upgrade everything." "What about the wife?" someone joked. The table erupted with laughter. Zachary leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said casually, "the timing worked out." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Zachary replied, raising his drink, "I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life tied to a marriage that kept me small." Several people whistled. Someone muttered, "Damn." The phone camera kept recording. Zachary didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't care. He had already begun to believe that his story had a clear ending. He had won. Meanwhile, across town, Eliza Montgomery sat at the small dining table in the apartment she would soon leave behind. A laptop screen glowed softly in front of her. Her notebook lay open beside it. She had received an email earlier that evening from Margaret Sloan, the attorney she had quietly hired after the meeting at Reeves Family Law. Margaret Sloan specialized in family law litigation and financial asset disputes. Her message was short: subject documentation. "Eliza, please continue collecting any public statements made by Zachary regarding the divorce and lottery winnings. Screenshots, videos, and witness accounts may become relevant in court." Eliza read the message twice. Then she opened a social media app. The videos from the Copper Room had already begun appearing online. One clip showed Zachary raising his glass. Another showed him talking about freedom. Another captured the moment someone joked about his wife. Eliza watched the videos without expression. Then she downloaded each one, saved them into a carefully labeled folder. Next, she opened her notebook. She wrote several new entries: Copper Room videos posted online, statements regarding divorce and financial independence, tone celebratory, dismissive of marriage. Her handwriting remained neat and controlled. After finishing, she closed the notebook and rested her hands on the table. The baby moved gently again. "Eliza," she murmured softly as if speaking to the child. Outside the apartment window, Sacramento's city lights flickered quietly. Across town, Zachary Walker was still celebrating the freedom he believed he had gained. Inside the bar, the music grew louder. Phones continued recording. Stories continued spreading. And somewhere within those casual videos, within the laughter, the drinks and the careless words, pieces of evidence were quietly forming. Evidence that would soon travel from phones and social media pages into legal documents. Eliza did not know exactly when they would be needed. But she knew something, with certainty. People who believed they had already won rarely paid attention to the things they were leaving behind. And Zachary Walker was leaving quite a trail. One video, one statement, one careless moment at a time. By early October, Sacramento's air had begun to cool. The sharp heat of summer faded into quieter mornings where thin layers of fog lingered over the Sacramento River, before the sun gradually burned them away. Inside the Sacramento County Family Court, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. On the fourth-floor courtroom, 4B had been assigned to the divorce case of Zachary Walker versus Eliza Montgomery Walker. It was not a large courtroom. The wooden benches were worn smooth from decades of use. Fluorescent lights cast a neutral glow across the room. At the front, the judge's bench stood elevated above the rest of the floor. Behind it sat Judge Rebecca Hollis. Judge Hollis had served on the family court bench for nearly 12 years. She was known among attorneys for her patience, but also for a particular intolerance toward dishonesty during financial disclosures. This morning, she reviewed a folder containing the early filings of the Walker divorce. Across the room, the attorneys prepared, quietly. On Zachary's side sat Daniel Reeves, the same attorney who had overseen the initial separation meeting. Reeves organized his documents neatly, while speaking quietly with his client. Zachary Walker looked confident. He wore a dark suit that still carried the crisp lines of a recent purchase. Across the aisle sat Margaret Sloan, Eliza's attorney. Margaret Sloan had a reputation very different from Reeves. Where Reeves preferred smooth negotiation, Sloan was known for methodical litigation. Every detail mattered to her. Every document, every word spoken under oath. Eliza sat beside her, hands resting calmly on the table. Her pregnancy was now unmistakable. The due date was only weeks away. Still, she had insisted on attending the hearing personally. Judge Hollis entered the courtroom precisely at 9 o'clock. Everyone rose. "Please be seated," she said. The room settled quickly. "This hearing concerns preliminary matters in the Walker divorce case," the judge began. "We will review financial disclosures and temporary arrangements regarding marital assets and child support." Her eyes moved briefly across both sides of the room. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "you may begin." Daniel Reeves stood smoothly. "Your Honor," he said, "my client, Mr. Zachary Walker, recently received lottery winnings totaling approximately $2 million. Judge Hollis nodded slightly. Reeves continued. "The ticket was purchased individually by Mr. Walker, and we believe the winnings should be treated as separate property." He handed a folder to the court clerk. "This document contains financial statements confirming the source of the funds." Judge Hollis reviewed the papers briefly. "And Mrs. Walker's position?" she asked. Margaret Sloan stood. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "my client is not contesting the existence of the lottery winnings." Judge Hollis raised an eyebrow slightly. "That simplifies matters," she said. Sloan nodded. "However, we believe the court should review the broader financial context surrounding the divorce." Reeves frowned slightly. "What context?" he asked. Sloan did not respond to him. Instead, she addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, we request that the court consider Mr. Walker's public statements regarding the reason for initiating divorce proceedings." Judge Hollis looked interested. "Public statements, yes." Sloan handed a small stack of printed documents to the clerk. These include social media posts and video recordings from multiple witnesses. Zachary shifted slightly in his chair. Reeves leaned toward him. "What videos?" he whispered. Zachary shrugged. Judge Hollis adjusted her glasses as she examined the first document. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "were you aware of these materials?" Reeves stood. "Your Honor, I have not yet reviewed these documents." Sloan spoke again. "Your Honor, the videos were recorded during a public gathering at a bar called the Copper Room." Judge Hollis looked up. "And what do these recordings show?" Sloan remained composed. "They show Mr. Walker celebrating his lottery winnings while discussing his decision to divorce his pregnant wife." A faint ripple of movement passed through the courtroom. Reeves turned sharply toward Zachary. "You didn't mention this," he said quietly. Zachary's confidence faded slightly. "It was just a party," he muttered. Judge Hollis gestured toward the clerk. "Let's review one of these videos." A screen at the side of the courtroom flickered to life. The video began. The lighting was dim and the music loud, but Zachary's voice was unmistakable. On the screen, he raised a glass. "I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life tied to a marriage that kept me small." Laughter filled the background of the recording. Judge Hollis watched silently. The video ended. The room was quiet again. Reeves cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "informal comments made during a social event should not be interpreted as legal intent." Sloan remained standing. "Of course not," she said calmly. "However, they do provide insight into motivation." Judge Hollis looked toward Zachary. "Mr. Walker," she said, "did you make these statements?" Zachary hesitated. "Well, yes. Were you referring to your marriage when you said it was holding you back?" Zachary shifted in his seat. "I was speaking casually. That was not my question." The courtroom grew very still. "Yes," Zachary admitted. Judge Hollis nodded slowly. She turned her attention back to the attorneys. "At this stage," she said, "the court is not determining final asset division." Both lawyers nodded. "However," she continued, "these statements may become relevant if disputes arise regarding financial conduct during the marriage." Sloan sat down calmly. Reeves made a note on his legal pad. Judge Hollis looked again at the documents. "For now, the court will maintain temporary arrangements as outlined in the initial filings." She paused. "But I advise both parties to be extremely careful regarding public statements moving forward." Her gaze rested briefly on Zachary. "Loose words have a way of becoming evidence." The hearing concluded shortly afterward. Outside the courtroom, attorneys gathered their files while people slowly filtered into the hallway. Reeves turned to Zachary immediately. "You need to stop talking about this situation publicly," he said. "It was just a joke." Zachary replied defensively. "It's not a joke once it appears in court," Reeves said. Across the hallway, Margaret Sloan spoke quietly with Eliza. "That went well," Sloan said. Eliza nodded. "I wasn't sure the videos would matter." "They matter," Sloan replied. She closed the folder containing the printed evidence. People rarely realize how their own words can reshape a legal case. Eliza glanced toward the opposite side of the hallway. Zachary stood there speaking anxiously with his attorney. For the first time since the lottery win, he did not look entirely certain of himself. Eliza watched for a moment. Then she turned away. The legal process had only just begun. And already Zachary Walker's version of the story was starting to sound less convincing. In the weeks after the first hearing, the case of Walker versus Walker moved quietly into its most meticulous phase, discovery. It was the stage of a legal process where stories stopped mattering and documents began to speak. Inside the office of Margaret Sloan, every file connected to the case was organized into carefully labeled folders. Bank records, emails, phone logs, social media posts, video recordings. Margaret Sloan believed in one principle. Above all others, patterns revealed truth. And Zachary Walker had created a very clear pattern. Late one Tuesday morning, Eliza sat across from Sloan in the attorney's office. The building overlooked downtown Sacramento, where traffic flowed steadily through narrow streets below. On the table between them lay several printed pages. "These are financial statements from Zachary's new personal bank account," Sloan said. Eliza studied the pages. Several large transactions appeared in the records: vehicle purchase, luxury watch retailer, multiple bar and restaurant charges. His spending increased immediately after receiving the lottery payout, Sloan explained. Eliza nodded. "That's consistent with what I observed." Sloan turned another page. More importantly, she said he began transferring funds into separate accounts shortly before initiating the divorce. Eliza remained calm. "What does that indicate?" "It may indicate an attempt to isolate assets." Sloan tapped the page lightly with her pen. "Courts take those patterns seriously." The office remained quiet for a moment. Outside, distant sirens echoed through the streets. Sloan opened another folder. "This is the next piece of information we obtained." Inside were printed emails, dozens of them. Most were conversations between Zachary and Victor Lang, his financial advisor. Eliza recognized Victor's name immediately. She had seen it many times in her notebook. Sloan slid the first page toward her. "Read this one." Eliza scanned the message. "From Zachary Walker to Victor Lang, subject asset separation. Victor, if the divorce happens quickly, do I keep full control of the lottery funds? I want to make sure nothing gets split later." Eliza continued reading. Victor's reply appeared beneath it. "Zachary, timing is important. The sooner legal separation occurs, the cleaner the asset structure becomes. You should consult with your attorney regarding the process. Victor." Eliza placed the page down carefully. Sloan watched her. "How do you feel about seeing these messages?" she asked. Eliza thought for a moment. "Not surprised," she said. Sloan nodded. "That's consistent with your earlier notes." Eliza had already provided Sloan with copies of her personal records. The notebook entries, the timeline of events, the documentation she had been quietly building for months. Sloan opened another folder. "Now let's look at the public statements." She pressed a key on her laptop. One of the Copper Room videos appeared on the screen again. Zachary raising a glass, laughing, talking about freedom. This time Sloan paused the video at a particular moment. "There," she said. The audio captured Zachary clearly. "I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life tied to a marriage that kept me small." Sloan turned toward Eliza. "Statements like that create legal context." Eliza nodded slowly. "They show motive." "Exactly." Sloan leaned back in her chair. "In divorce cases involving sudden wealth, courts pay attention to intent." Eliza looked down at her notebook again. The careful lines of her own handwriting stared back at her. Dates, observations, recorded phrases. Everything she had written quietly now existed alongside official legal evidence. Across town, Zachary Walker sat inside a different office. His attorney, Daniel Reeves, looked far less relaxed than usual. "You should have told me about those emails," Reeves said sharply. Zachary rubbed his forehead. "They're just messages. They're written evidence of your financial strategy," Reeves replied. Zachary leaned forward. "I was just asking questions." Reeves sighed. "That's not how a judge sees it." He slid a printed document across the desk. "This is the discovery request from Margaret Sloan." Zachary scanned the page. "They want access to everything related to financial decisions since the lottery win." Zachary leaned back in his chair. "This is ridiculous." Reeves folded his hands. "Welcome to divorce litigation." For the first time since the lottery win, Zachary began to feel something unfamiliar. Pressure. The situation that had once seemed simple now felt complicated. Meanwhile, the legal review continued. 2 days later, Sloan received another piece of evidence. An audio recording. It had been captured during the same Copper Room celebration weeks earlier. The recording came from one of the bartenders who had recognized Zachary from news circulating about the lottery win. Inside Sloane's office, the audio played quietly. Zachary's voice echoed through the speakers. $2 million changes everything, someone in the background asked. Including your marriage, Zachary laughed. Especially my marriage. The room fell silent when the recording ended. Sloane saved the file. Then she turned toward Eliza. Would you like to hear it again? Eliza shook her head. No. Sloane studied her expression. You're handling this very calmly. Eliza rested her hands lightly on her stomach. I've had time to process it. Sloane nodded thoughtfully. Many people in your situation would feel angry. Eliza considered that. Anger doesn't change facts. Sloane closed the laptop. That's true. She gathered the folders together. Between the financial transfers, the emails, and the recordings, the timeline is very clear. Eliza asked the obvious question. What does that mean for the case? Sloane answered carefully. It means Zachary's narrative that this divorce had nothing to do with money will be difficult to defend. Eliza absorbed the information quietly. Outside the office window, Sacramento continued its ordinary rhythm. Cars moving, people walking, life continuing without interruption. Yet within the legal system, the pieces of Zachary Walker's story were slowly being arranged into a very different picture. A picture built not from accusations, but from his own words, his own emails, his own decisions. Later that evening, Eliza returned home and opened her notebook again. She wrote one final entry for the day. Discovery evidence expanding. Email correspondence bank. Transfers audio recordings. She paused, then added one more line. Pattern now visible. Eliza closed the notebook and placed it beside her bed. Somewhere across the city, Zachary Walker was still trying to convince himself that the situation remained under control. But inside the quiet framework of legal evidence, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. And soon, another revelation would appear, one that Zachary had never imagined. Because somewhere in the legal documents waiting to be filed, the name Eliza Montgomery Whitmore was about to appear. By mid-October, the Sacramento air carried the quiet signals of early autumn. The heat that once pressed heavily against the city had softened. Leaves along the sidewalks turned faint shades of gold, and the mornings arrived cooler and quieter. Inside the offices of Margaret Sloane, however, the pace of work had intensified. Stacks of documents covered the large oak conference table, financial statements, legal drafts, trust documents, and one file that had not yet been introduced into the divorce proceedings. The folder, labeled Whitmore Estate. Confidential Eliza Montgomery sat across from Sloane, her hands resting gently on her stomach. The baby was due within weeks now, and every movement required more effort than before. Yet her expression remained composed. Margaret Sloane opened the folder carefully. The estate attorneys in Chicago have finalized the preliminary transfer documents, she said. She slid a sheet across the table. Eliza read the line at the top. Primary beneficiary, Eliza Montgomery. Below, it appeared several detailed descriptions of asset holdings, corporate shares, commercial real estate, investment portfolios, all belonging to the Whitmore estate. Sloane folded her hands. The estimated total value remains approximately $208 million, she said. Eliza nodded. She had heard the number before, but it still felt strangely distant. Numbers, after all, were abstract. They lived on paper. But the consequences of numbers often appeared in people's behavior. What happens now? Eliza asked. Sloane leaned back in her chair. The estate lawyers are preparing the official legal filings that will confirm you as the controlling heir. Eliza glanced toward the window. And once those filings happen, they become public record. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind. Will Zachary find out? Sloane smiled faintly. Yes. Eliza nodded slowly. Sooner or later. Sloane tapped the Whitmore folder gently. In fact, the timing may intersect directly with the divorce case. How Sloane pulled another document from the stack. Because once the inheritance becomes public, the court will need to consider its existence when evaluating long-term financial planning for your child. Eliza considered that. The legal implications were complex, but the reality behind them was simple. Zachary had divorced her believing he was the wealthier partner. That assumption was about to change. Across town, Zachary Walker sat inside Victor Lang's office, looking considerably less confident than he had weeks earlier. The discovery phase of the divorce had been uncomfortable. Reeves had warned him repeatedly about speaking publicly. The copper room videos had already caused enough problems. Victor poured 2 glasses of water and placed one in front of him. "You look stressed," Victor said. "This whole thing is getting complicated," Zachary replied. Victor sat down across from him. "Divorce usually is." Zachary ran a hand through his hair. "Reeves says Sloane is digging into everything. That's her job." Zachary exhaled slowly. "At least the lottery money is secure." Victor nodded. "Yes." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Victor leaned forward slightly. "There's something else you should keep in mind." "What financial surprises?" Zachary frowned. "What kind of surprises?" Victor shrugged. "In divorce cases, unexpected assets sometimes appear." Zachary laughed. "Not in this one." Victor studied him carefully. "Are you certain?" Zachary leaned back in his chair. "Eliza's an accountant at a hospital," he said. "She doesn't have hidden millions." Victor didn't respond, but experience had taught him that certainty in financial matters was often misplaced. Meanwhile, back in Sloane's office, another discussion was unfolding. Sloane placed a printed letter on the table. "This arrived from Whitmore and Carter LLP this morning." Eliza read the letter carefully. The message was brief. "Formal notice of estate transfer filing scheduled for October 28th. Public records will reflect the designation of Eliza Montgomery as controlling heir to Whitmore Capital Holdings." Eliza looked up. "That's 2 weeks from now." "Yes, and the next divorce hearing October 30th. Eliza remained silent. Sloane allowed the moment to settle. "Timing," she said quietly, "is sometimes very interesting in legal matters." Eliza gave a faint smile. "Coincidence?" Sloane raised an eyebrow. "Let's call it alignment." The next several days passed quietly. Eliza continued preparing for the baby's arrival. Hospital bags, medical appointments, small clothes folded neatly in drawers. At night, she sometimes felt the baby shifting more strongly. A reminder that life was about to change in ways far more important than courtrooms or financial documents. Yet outside the apartment, the legal world continued moving toward its next moment of revelation. On the morning of October 28th, the estate filing became official. Within hours, legal databases updated the public records. A simple line appeared inside financial registries: Whitmore Capital Holdings, controlling heir Eliza Montgomery. The information began spreading quickly through financial networks, investment analysts, corporate filings, legal databases. Within a single afternoon, the name, Eliza Montgomery, had quietly become associated with one of the largest privately held estates in the region. 2 days later, Zachary Walker walked into the Sacramento family court for the next hearing. He felt more prepared this time. Reeves had briefed him carefully. Avoid unnecessary statements. Answer questions clearly. Let the lawyers handle the rest. As he stepped into the hallway outside courtroom 4B, he noticed Margaret Sloane speaking with Eliza across the room. Something about their calm expressions unsettled him slightly. He couldn't explain why. The hearing began shortly after. Judge Rebecca Hollis entered the courtroom and took her seat. "Before we proceed," she said, "reviewing the updated case file, the court has received new financial disclosures." Reeves looked surprised. "What disclosures?" he asked. Sloane stood. "Your Honor, my client has recently been named the primary heir to the Whitmore estate." The words echoed through the courtroom. Reeves froze. Zachary turned toward Eliza. "What he whispered." Sloane continued calmly. "The estate includes controlling ownership of Whitmore Capital Holdings and related assets." Judge Hollis adjusted her glasses. "And the estimated value," Sloane answered without hesitation. "Approximately $200 million. The courtroom fell completely silent. Zachary stared at Eliza, as if he had misheard. 200 million. The number repeated itself in his mind again and again. Across the room, Eliza sat quietly beside her attorney. Her posture remained calm. Her hands rested gently over the curve of her stomach. For weeks, Zachary had believed he was the wealthier partner in this divorce. Now the truth had appeared in a single sentence, and nothing about the situation felt simple anymore. The silence inside courtroom 4B lasted several seconds longer than anyone expected. $200 million had a way of interrupting normal conversation. At the front of the room, Judge Rebecca Hollis studied the updated financial disclosure in the case file. Her expression remained neutral, but the shift in the courtroom atmosphere was unmistakable. Across the aisle, Daniel Reeves slowly turned toward his client. "You didn't know about this," he whispered. Zachary Walker shook his head. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. 200 million. The number felt unreal. For weeks he had believed the narrative was clear he was the one who had suddenly become wealthy. Now that assumption had collapsed. Reeves straightened his tie and stood. "Your Honor," he said carefully, this information was not previously disclosed. Margaret Sloane remained calm. The inheritance was not finalized until this week, she explained. The moment it became public record, we filed the disclosure. Judge Hollis nodded slowly. "That is the correct procedure." Her gaze moved briefly toward Eliza. Mrs. Walker sat quietly beside her attorney, hands resting over the curve of her stomach. She had not spoken. She had not reacted. She simply observed. Judge Hollis closed the file. "Well," she said calmly, "that certainly adds new context to this case." A faint ripple of quiet laughter moved through the courtroom benches. Zachary felt heat rise in his face. He avoided looking toward Eliza. Judge Hollis continued. "The inheritance itself is not marital property as it was received individually by Mrs. Walker." Reeves nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." However, the judge added, the court must consider long-term financial arrangements involving the child. She glanced at the case notes again. Especially given the scale of these resources. The hearing continued for another 20 minutes, but Zachary barely heard the discussion. His thoughts remained fixed on one question. How had this happened? After the hearing ended, people slowly filtered out of the courtroom. Zachary remained seated for several seconds before standing. Reeves gathered his files quickly. "We need to talk," the attorney said quietly. But Zachary wasn't listening. Across the room, Eliza stood slowly, supported briefly by Margaret Sloane as she adjusted her balance. For the first time since the announcement, Zachary looked directly at her. $200 million, and she had known all this time. Outside the courtroom, the hallway filled with the low murmur of lawyers discussing other cases. Zachary approached slowly. "Eliza," he said. She turned toward him. Her expression remained calm. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked. Eliza considered the question. "I wasn't planning to." Zachary stared at her. "You knew this was happening while we were getting divorced." "Yes." "And you didn't say anything." "Number." Reeves stepped slightly closer. Mrs. Walker had no legal obligation to disclose the inheritance before it became official, he said. Zachary ignored him. "You let me go through this whole process thinking—" He stopped himself. thinking what Eliza asked gently. Zachary hesitated. That I was the one with money. Eliza nodded slightly. That seemed important to you. Zachary ran a hand through his hair. You could have told me. Eliza's voice remained steady. You never asked. The sentence landed softly, but its meaning was unmistakable. Margaret Sloane stepped forward slightly. Mr. Walker, if you have further questions, they should be addressed through legal counsel. Zachary looked at her frustrated. I'm not talking about the legal side, but the legal side was exactly where everything now lived. Across the hallway, several attorneys had begun whispering quietly. News traveled quickly in court buildings. A divorce involving a $2 million lottery win was interesting. A divorce involving a $200 million inheritance was something else entirely. Zachary turned back toward Eliza. I didn't know about your grandfather, he said. I didn't either, she replied. So you just kept it quiet. Yes, why Eliza paused. Because the divorce was already happening. Zachary frowned. That's not an answer. Eliza looked at him carefully. For months, she said softly, you explained that the divorce was about freedom. Zachary said nothing. You explained that money had changed your future. He shifted uncomfortably. You explained that our marriage was holding you back. The words echoed something he had once said himself. At the Copper Room, in a video now preserved inside legal records, Eliza continued, I didn't want to interrupt that belief. Zachary looked away. For the first time since the lottery win, he felt something he had not expected. Embarrassment. Behind him, Reeves cleared his throat. We should leave, the attorney said, quietly. But Zachary wasn't finished. Eliza, he said again. She waited. What happens now? Eliza rested a hand on her stomach. The divorce continues. That's it. Yes. Zachary searched her face. You don't want to talk about this. We are talking about it. No, he said. I mean, everything. The word hung between them. Everything. The marriage, the baby, the sudden reversal of fortune. Eliza's expression remained calm. Those conversations should have happened earlier, she said. Zachary had no response. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret Sloane gently touched Eliza's arm. We should go, she said. Eliza nodded. She turned away and began walking slowly down the hallway. Sloane followed beside her. Zachary stood motionless. For weeks he had imagined a future where he moved forward alone, financially secure, free from what he believed was a limiting marriage. Now the story had changed, but not in the way he expected, because Eliza Montgomery had never argued with him. She had never tried to stop him. She had simply allowed his decisions to unfold. Across the hallway, Reeves spoke quietly. Zachary, what we need to discuss how this changes things. Zachary exhaled slowly. He watched as Eliza reached the elevator at the end of the corridor. $200 million. And she was still walking away with the same calm dignity she had carried through every step of the process. When the elevator doors closed, Zachary finally understood something that had not been clear before. Money had changed many things in this story, but it had not changed Eliza. By the time the final hearing arrived, Sacramento had moved fully into late autumn. Cool winds drifted through the city streets, carrying dry leaves across sidewalks and parking lots. The sky held that pale gray tone that often settled over Northern California before winter. Inside Sacramento County Family Court, the atmosphere was steady, procedural, and quiet. Divorce cases rarely ended with drama. Most concluded with paperwork. On the morning of the final hearing, courtroom 4B filled slowly. Judge Rebecca Hollis entered promptly at 9 o'clock. The room stood briefly in respect before settling again. At the plaintiff's table sat Zachary Walker beside his attorney Daniel Reeves. Across the aisle sat Eliza Montgomery Walker and her attorney Margaret Sloane. Eliza's pregnancy had reached its final stage. Her movements were careful, deliberate, but her expression remained as composed as ever. Several additional observers were present that morning. 2 attorneys from Whitmore and Carter LLP had flown in from Chicago. Jonathan Carter sat quietly near the back row, observing the proceedings with calm interest. Judge Hollis opened the case file. Today, we finalize the dissolution of marriage between Zachary Walker and Eliza Montgomery Walker, she said. Her tone was measured and neutral. Counsel, are there any remaining disputes before the court issues its decision? Daniel Reeves stood. No major disputes remain, Your Honor. Margaret Sloan nodded slightly. That is correct. Judge Hollis turned a page in the file. Very well. She began reviewing the case summary aloud. Mr. Walker retains the lottery winnings acquired during the marriage subject to previous tax obligations. Zachary listened quietly. Once that statement had been the central point of the case. Now it felt almost insignificant. Judge Hollis continued. Mrs. Walker retains the inheritance received from the Whitmore estate, which is not considered marital property. Jonathan Carter remained still in the back of the courtroom. The judge paused briefly. The court also acknowledges the establishment of a financial trust for the unborn child of the marriage. Margaret Sloan stood. Your Honor, the Whitmore estate has created a family trust fund to ensure long-term educational and health care support for the child. Judge Hollis nodded. That documentation has been reviewed. She turned toward Zachary. Mr. Walker, the trust ensures that your child will receive support independent of your personal finances. Zachary nodded quietly. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hollis continued. Child custody arrangements remain joint as previously agreed, with primary residence assigned to Mrs. Walker for the child's early years. Reeves confirmed the agreement. Correct. The judge reviewed one final page before closing the file. Then this court formally dissolves the marriage of Zachary Walker and Eliza Montgomery Walker, effective immediately. Her gavel tapped once against the wooden block. The sound was small, but it marked the official end of a 5-year marriage. For a moment, no one moved. Then, attorneys began gathering their documents. The legal process was complete. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt quieter than it had during earlier hearings. The tension that once surrounded the case had faded into something more reflective. Eliza stood slowly. Margaret Sloan helped steady the chair beside her. Are you all right? Sloan asked. I'm fine, Eliza replied softly. Jonathan Carter approached them. Congratulations, he said gently. Eliza smiled faintly. I'm not sure divorce is something people usually celebrate. Carter nodded. Perhaps not, but there was a quiet understanding in his expression. Across the hallway, Zachary stood with Reeves. So, that's it, Zachary said. Yes, Reeves replied. Zachary exhaled slowly. All that just ends like this. Reeves closed his briefcase. That's usually how divorce works. Zachary looked down the hallway. Eliza stood near the elevator with Sloan and Carter. She was speaking quietly with them. For a moment, Zachary considered walking away, but instead he crossed the hallway. Eliza. She turned toward him. For the first time in weeks, they stood alone without lawyers speaking between them. So Zachary said. So Eliza replied. He hesitated. I guess this is where we go our separate ways. Yes. Zachary looked at her carefully. You're moving to Chicago, right? Yes. To run your grandfather's company. To oversee it, she corrected gently. Zachary nodded. That's a pretty big life change. It is. He glanced briefly at her stomach. When's the baby due? Soon? Do you know if it's a boy or girl? A girl. Zachary smiled faintly. Have you picked a name? Eliza thought for a moment. Clara. Zachary nodded. That's a nice name. The hallway fell quiet again. Finally, Zachary spoke. I meant what I said earlier. Which part? That I hope things work out for both of us. Eliza studied him carefully. Then she nodded. I hope so too. There was no anger in her voice, no sarcasm, just honesty. Zachary shifted slightly. You know, if things had happened differently. He stopped himself. Eliza did not finish the sentence for him. Instead, she said gently, but they didn't. Zachary gave a small nod. No. The elevator doors opened behind her. Margaret Sloane stepped inside first. Jonathan Carter followed. Eliza turned back toward Zachary one last time. Take care of yourself, she said. You too. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed quietly. Zachary stood in the hallway for several seconds after they disappeared. For months he had believed that money had placed him in control of his future. But as the courthouse slowly emptied around him, that belief felt strangely hollow. Because the person who had truly remained in control the entire time had never raised her voice, never argued, never tried to stop him. She had simply walked forward, with patience, with dignity, and now she was gone. Winter arrived quietly in Chicago. The wind off Lake Michigan carried a sharp cold that moved through the city's streets with steady persistence. Buildings along LaSalle Street stood tall against the gray sky, their windows reflecting the muted light of early December. Inside the headquarters of Whitmore Capital Holdings, the atmosphere was calm and deliberate. At the top-floor conference room, a group of executives sat around a long table reviewing financial reports. Market forecasts glowed across the large screen on the wall. At the head of the table sat Eliza Montgomery. Her posture remained as composed as ever, though life had changed in ways few people could fully understand. 2 weeks earlier, she had given birth to a daughter. The baby, Clara Montgomery, now slept peacefully in a nearby office nursery prepared by the Whitmore Company staff. Motherhood had arrived quietly, without ceremony, without drama, just as many of the most important changes in Eliza's life always had. Jonathan Carter sat near the end of the conference table, reviewing a document. The energy investment portfolio remains stable, he said, but there may be expansion opportunities in renewable infrastructure. Eliza listened carefully. She had spent the past several weeks learning the structure of the Whitmore estate: corporate, governance, investment boards, trust responsibilities. The wealth she had inherited came with complex obligations, but Eliza approached it the same way she had always approached numbers: carefully, methodically, patiently. When the meeting ended, executives slowly filed out of the room. Jonathan Carter remained behind. You're adjusting quickly, he said. Eliza closed the folder in front of her. I'm learning. That's more than most heirs manage in their first months. Eliza smiled faintly. I've spent my life organizing financial records. This is just a larger version of the same work. Carter nodded. Still, he said, $200 million tends to overwhelm people. Eliza looked toward the window. Snow had begun falling lightly across the Chicago skyline. I've noticed that, she said. Across the country in Sacramento, Zachary Walker's life had returned to something closer to its original shape. The lottery money remained. After taxes and several expensive purchases, the remaining balance had settled into investment accounts managed by Victor Lang. The Tesla still sat in his parking space, but the excitement surrounding his sudden wealth had faded. Friends who once gathered at the Copper Room appeared less frequently now. Conversations about investment opportunities had grown quieter. Life had not become the dramatic transformation Zachary once imagined. Instead, it had become something simpler. Routine. One afternoon, while sitting inside a small coffee shop near his apartment, Zachary noticed something on his phone. A financial news article. The headline caught his attention. Whitmore Capital Holdings announces new leadership structure. He opened the article. A photograph appeared at the top. Eliza Montgomery stood in front of the company's Chicago headquarters. Her expression remained the same calm one he remembered. The article described her as the new controlling heir of the Whitmore estate. It mentioned her background in financial accounting, her transition into leadership, and the establishment of a trust for her newborn daughter. Zachary stared at the screen for a long moment. Clara. He had not yet met his daughter. The custody arrangements would allow him to visit once Eliza returned to Sacramento for future legal scheduling. But for now, the distance between Chicago and California felt larger than geography. It felt like time. He closed the article slowly. Outside the coffee shop window, traffic moved steadily through the afternoon. Life continued. Meanwhile in Chicago, Eliza walked quietly through the hallway outside her office. The nursery door stood slightly open. Inside, Clara slept peacefully in a small crib near the window. Eliza stepped inside and sat beside her. The room was quiet except for the soft rhythm of the baby's breathing. For several minutes she simply watched. There was no anger left in her thoughts, no desire to revisit the past. Life had already moved forward. The divorce, the inheritance, the courtroom conversations. All of it had become part of a story that no longer needed to be retold. Jonathan Carter appeared quietly at the doorway. "The board has approved the new investment strategy," he said. Eliza nodded. "I'll review the documents this afternoon." Carter hesitated slightly. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Many people in your position might feel vindicated." Eliza looked up. "Vindicated your husband left after winning $2 million, Carter said, only to discover that you inherited $200 million. Eliza considered the idea, then she shook her head. "I don't feel vindicated." No. Carter waited. Eliza looked toward Clara again. "Money reveals people," she said quietly, "but it doesn't need to punish them." Carter nodded slowly. That answer told him everything he needed to know about the woman now responsible for the Whitmore estate. Later that evening, as snow continued falling across Chicago, Eliza stood beside the window of her office. The city lights reflected across the frozen surface of the lake. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Zachary. "I hope Clara is healthy. If you ever need anything for her, let me know." Eliza read the message once. Then she placed the phone down. She did not respond immediately. Not because of anger, not because of resentment, but because some conversations required patience, the same patience she had carried through every step of the past year. Eliza looked once more toward the nursery. Clara stirred gently in her sleep. Life had changed, not because of money, but because of choices. And now quietly, and without bitterness, Eliza Montgomery stepped into the future she had inherited, with dignity, with responsibility, and without looking back.
Stories like this rarely end with shouting or revenge. More often, they end quietly with a decision to walk forward, rather than argue about the past. If this story made you reflect on how money reveals character, you're welcome to share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, justice, and dignity, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Sometimes the most powerful endings are the quietest ones.